Welcome to our talk against Fregean quantification. Thanks to Robert and Kai for reading it and sending us comments. In the basic laws of arithmetic, Frege develops a formal language, the Begriffsschrift, and offers what many regard as one of the first compositional semantic theories for a language. So Frege assigns a Bedeutung or meaning or denotation to every expression of the language, and he does so in a specific way. So the semantics first assigns a denotation to the basic or non-derived expressions of the language. Frege then offers rules for specifying the derived expressions from these basic expressions. Finally, Frege offers rules for determining the denotations of derived expressions in terms of the denotations of the more basic expressions. And as I've said, this theory appears to be one of the first cases of an apparently compositional semantic theory. A semantic theory is compositional for a syntactic theory when the denotation of a complex expression is determined as a function from the denotations of the simpler expressions from which it's derived. So two complex expressions that are composed by applying the same formation rule to a sequence of co-denoting expressions will themselves denote the same thing. So Frege couples this idea of compositionality with two theses about what the denotations of certain kinds of expressions are. So first of all, the denotation of a term, a proper name, say, Frege takes to be just an object, the referent of the term. So the denotation of a name like Brian is just me. Similarly, the denotation of a sentence he thinks is something that can enter as an input to a truth function. So the denotation of a sentence like Brian is standing is something that could enter into the truth as an input to the truth function. It's not the case that to output the truth value of the sentence, it's not the case that Brian is standing. Therefore, the denotation of a sentence, because it can be the input to a truth function, has just got to be its truth value. So the denotation of Brian is standing will just be its truth value, the true. Frege adds to this the idea that the denotation of a predicate is a function that takes you from the denotation of the term to the denotation of the sentence. So the denotation of is standing is a function that takes you from an object, say me, Brian, to a truth value, the true. This leads to what's regarded as one of Frege's central advances. And it's his thought that quantifiers are second level predicates or second level functions. A quantifier, like everything, takes a concept, a predicate, as an argument and outputs the true just in case the denotation of the predicate maps everything to the true. So everything is standing will be true just in case is standing denotes a function that maps every argument to the true. This analysis of quantification is groundbreaking, but it faces one significant hurdle that we want to discuss in detail. Namely, not every quantified sentence results from applying a quantifier phrase to a simple predicate like standing. We also, in order to have a complete language, need to apply quantifiers to what are called complex predicates, like being charming and sincere. So we view the central challenge to the Fregean approach to quantification to be the following. The Fregean has to provide rules for the formation and semantic evaluation of complex predicates. And we take one of the core goals of these rules, that the rule for forming complex predicates and for semantically evaluating them should be compositional. So the rival Tarskian approach seems to overcome this problem immediately. It incorporates variables in the basis of its syntactic and semantic theory. Variables are genuine syntactic and semantic units, and they play a role in forming what are called open sentences, like X is charming and X is sincere. And then a quantifier, like for all X, attaches to that open sentence to form a quantified formula. What we will show is that the Tarskian approach faces a dilemma. It either violates compositionality or it must reject truth and reference centrality. And this has often been taken to be a strike against the Tarskian approach. So Evans says, the Fregean theory with its direct recursion on truth is much simpler and smoother than the Tarskian alternative, whose mechanism of infinite sequences differing at most this or that place is dispensed with. But its interest doesn't stem from this, but rather from examination at a more philosophical level. It seems to me that serious exception can be taken to the Tarskian theory on the grounds that it loses sight of or takes no account of the centrality of sentences and of truth in the theory of meaning. So the worry is that by appealing to these open sentences that don't have absolute truth values, the Tarskian theory is losing something philosophically important. What we will argue is that the Fregean alternatives must address what we've called the central challenge to the Fregean theory, the formation of complex predicates, and that the standard Fregean ways of doing this, we'll argue, face exactly the same dilemma faced by the Tarskian approach. Indeed, one thing we'll argue is that if you want to have a compositional semantic theory on this Fregean view, you have to go in for a view that looks rather like one of the most radical versions of the Tarskian theory, which is called variablism, that the semantics of proper names is an instance of the semantics of variables. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll very briefly discuss the Tarskian semantic theory and how it faces the dilemma. As I've mentioned, Tarskian standardly incorporate two types of basic expressions, constants and variables. They also have n-ary predicates. The Tarskian also has rules for forming complex sentences in terms of the basic sentences. So given a predicate pi in n terms, we can have a formula that results from the application of some rule to those expressions. So we'll abbreviate this formula as pi alpha 1 through alpha n. Though it's important to note that this is a meta-language description of a formula. We're not taking an actual stand on what the object language expressions are. They may be sequences or tree structures or Gödel numbers. What's important to us is that there's some operation that takes us from a predicate and n argument terms to a formula. Analogously, there's a negation operation that takes a sentence to its negation. There's a conjunction operation that takes two sentences to their conjunction. Finally, there's a quantification operation. This operation takes a variable alpha in a sentence phi and yields a quantified sentence, which we'll abbreviate as for all alpha phi. Again, this is a meta-language description of an object language expression. So that's the syntax. In its standard development, the Tarskian semantics works by assigning a denotation to every expression in the language relative to an assignment function. So a constant will denote its referent relative to any assignment function. A variable relative to an assignment function will denote the value of that variable, the output of applying that assignment function to that variable. Superficially then, this approach seems to preserve at least reference centrality because the denotation of a term is its referent. It also seems to preserve truth centrality because we can specify the denotation of a sentence as a truth value. So the denotation of a sentence of a predication, pi alpha 1 through alpha n, relative to an assignment function sigma, will be the true if the denotations of alpha 1 through alpha n relative to sigma are in the extension of pi relative to sigma and the false otherwise. Negation, a negation of phi, the negation of phi will be true relative to sigma, just in case phi is false relative to sigma. Finally, a conjunction of two sentences, phi and psi, is true relative to sigma, just in case the denotations of phi and psi are also true relative to sigma. So these rules are all compositional. The denotations of the complex expressions are specified in terms of the denotations of their parts. They're a function of the denotations of their parts. The rule for quantification is a little more unwieldy. And the problem is it's not compositional. So take a quantified formula for all v phi. The denotation of that relative to an assignment function, sigma, will be the true just in case the embedded formula phi is true relative to every assignment function that varies from sigma at most in what it assigns to v, and it's false otherwise. So what this means is that the truth value of, or the denotation of, for all v phi relative to sigma isn't a function of the denotation of v relative to sigma and phi relative to sigma, but rather relative to some other assignment function. So therefore, the semantics isn't compositional. So for example, it could be that relative to an assignment function sigma, x has the same denotation as some constant a. It would follow that Rxa and Rax have the same denotation. It would then follow that for all x, Rxa and for all x, Rax have the same denotation. But we don't want that. Because it seems clearly possible that everyone loves A, but it's not the case that A loves everyone. We could try to restore compositionality by complicating the semantic values of the basic expressions. So we could complicate the semantic values of terms by taking the semantic value of a variable, say, to be, rather than an object, we could take it to be a function from assignment functions into objects. And similarly, the semantic value of a constant will just be a constant function from assignment functions into objects. We could then sort of have predication rules where rather than a predication pi alpha 1 through alpha n denoting a truth value, it denotes a function from assignment functions into truth values. And finally, a quantified sentence like for all v phi would be true just in case. So it would also not denote a truth value, but it would denote a function from assignment functions into truth values. So this construal of the Tarskian approach is compositional. So we've saved compositionality, but it obviously abandons the Fregean doctrines that the denotation of a term is an object and the denotation of a sentence is a truth value. The denotation of a variable is a function from assignments to objects, and the denotation of a sentence is a function from assignments to truth values. So this Tarskian approach then is accused of doing exactly what Evans thinks it shouldn't do, namely abandoning truth and reference as the central notions of semantic theory. And the worry is attempting to reinstate these doctrines will lead to failures of compositionality.
Okay, so we've seen how the Tarskian view faces the dilemma, and now we want to argue that the Fregean view faces the same dilemma. So in Frege's approach, a quantified sentence is derived by first deriving an unquantified sentence, like Caesar conquered Gaul, and then removing a name to get the first level monadic predicate blank conquered Gaul. And then we take the quantifier, which is a second level predicate, and combine that with this first level predicate, and that results in the quantified sentence. In this case, everything conquered Gaul. And this process can be iterated to derive multiply quantified sentences, such as everything is identical to something. And it's important to note here that the German letters, or Gothic letters, that occur in these quantified formulas, like A and E, that look like Tarskian variables, are in fact not best thought of as expressions of the language, but merely typographic parts of the quantifier signs. Okay, so there's three features of the Fregean approach that we want to highlight. First, quantifiers are predicates of predicates. Second, quantified formulas are derived from names and closed sentences. So, in contrast to the Tarskian approach, there are no open formulas. Instead, the complex predicates that combined with quantifiers are derived from a syntactic rule of name removal. And this is what creates the gaps. And finally, alphabetic variants are identical. So multiple syntactic derivations result in the very same complex expression. For example, the predicate that results from removing the name B from the sentence RBA is identified with the predicate that results from removing C from RCA. Now this feature has been extended by more recent proponents who appeal to Quine-Barbauchi diagrams in order to represent a quantified formula as this wire diagram. We'll get to that. But first, focusing on feature 1, quantifiers are predicates of predicates. So some have taken this to show that Frege's treatment of quantification is compositional. So Partee says Frege developed the syntax and semantics of quantifiers, and in a sense he did it more compositionally than Tarski. So what she has in mind here is the quantifier rule on Frege's approach, which takes a predicate and yields a quantified sentence. Right, so if quantifiers are predicates of predicates, well then we can assign a semantic value to the quantifier, and there's no threat to compositionality. It's just the semantics of predication. But only saying that much leaves out an important part of the story, because we still have to derive and evaluate complex predicates. And the way this is standardly done in contemporary formal semantics would be to introduce a rule like lambda here, which takes a variable and a sentence and yields a monadic predicate, the lambda abstract. But of course, this rule requires variables, and there are open formulas, and it's all very Tarskian, so it's going to run into the problems we've outlined above. And this is not the way the Fregean wants to go. Instead, Frege introduces a rule for forming complex predicates out of a sentence and a name. So the rule removes occurrences of the name from the sentence. Call this rule delta. Take a name alpha and a sentence phi and yield a monadic predicate, which we'll abbreviate as hat alpha phi. Okay, so now has the Fregean dispensed with variables and thereby avoided the dilemma we've outlined? Well, no, we don't think so. So the Fregean approach has not really dispensed with variables, but has merely used the same letters for both names and variables. So on our view, variables just are expressions that play a particular role in the syntactic derivation and semantic evaluation of quantified formulas. So this F2 feature is a form of what you could call variableism, the view that names and variables constitute a unified semantic category. And it differs from more recent and popular versions of variableism only by using letters from the beginning of the alphabet rather than the end to regimate names and variables. Okay, now no matter what you think about the variableism issue, it's clear that rule delta is no help in reconciling compositionality with truth and reference centrality. So consider the complex predicate that results from removing A from RAB and the complex predicate that results from removing A from RBA. We want the denotations of those complex predicates to be distinct, but they're formed by the same syntactic rule. And if we assume that the names A and B co-refer, then by compositionality, the sentence RAB and the sentence RBA will co-denote, And again, by compositionality, the complex predicates will codenote because they were formed by applying the same syntactic derivation rule to sequences of expressions that respectively codenote. Okay, and it should be no surprise that the Fregean approach runs into the same problem as the Tarskian approach, since they offer structurally isomorphic derivations of quantified formulas. If you look at the Tarskian derivation side by side with the Fregean derivation, you see that the only difference is where the Tarskian uses x and the lambda rule, the Fregean uses a and the delta rule, but the underlying semantic issues are the same. Okay, so now there's the final feature of Frege's approach, which might be thought to get him off the hook. So Frege's rule delta identifies alphabetic variant complex predicates. So applying the removal rule to A and RAB results in the very same complex predicate as applying the rule delta to C and RCB. Right, so like removing a name literally leaves a gap or a mark of incompleteness. We get this thing, R blank B, so they're identified. And some philosophers see an escape from the variable in the fact that alphabetically variant complex predicates and going further than Frege's sentences themselves are identified. So Kaplan says, we need no variables. We could permit gaping formulas, as Frege would have it, and use wiring diagrams to link the quantifier to its gaps and to channel in values. So the suggestion here is to render a quantified formula not as this thing with variables, but as the wire diagram that's displayed on the bottom, where we just link the quantifier to the gaps in the complex predicates, and it looks like there's no variables involved, and it looks like we might avoid the issues that the Tarskian view runs into. But even here, we have to offer a syntactic derivation of a quantified formula and a complex predicate. So in the derivation of a quantified formula, such as everything R's B, the derivation of the complex predicate R blank B still runs by way of applying a syntactic operation, in this case delta, to a name and a sentence, for example, to A and RAB. Then the quantifier rule pi is applied to the result, as is displayed on the screen. And for this to be compositional, the name can't denote its referent and the sentence cannot denote its truth value for all the same reasons that we've perhaps already tediously enumerated. Okay, so we've seen that the Fregean features F1 through F3 don't avoid the choice faced by the Tarskian. They have to reject compositionality or reject truth and reference centrality. And in particular, the rule for constructing a predicate or a quantified formula from a name and a closed sentence violates compositionality if the name denotes an object and the sentence denotes a truth value. And contemporary descendants of Frege's approach, including Mates' beta variant approach and Wehmeyer's Fregean first-order logic, also don't avoid the choice. So very quickly, some people have taken Frege to be offering a substitutional account of quantification. And of course, substitutional quantification is not compositional. Right? So you could go that way, but it's not compositional. And likewise, Mates' beta variant approach is not compositional. Both Mates' approach and the substitutional approach share the feature that the open sentence, open formula, that a quantified sentence is syntactically derived from are not even assigned a semantic value. On the other hand, we could go with a compositional implementation, such as Wehmeyer's 2018, where if you look at his Neo-Fregean abstraction rule, what's going on is we are looking at the models that differ at most in what they assign to a name alpha, instead of on a Tarskian approach where we look at the assignments that differ at most in what they assign to a variable such as x. And this can be made compositional as long as the denotation of a name is a function from models onto objects, and the denotation of a sentence is a function from models onto truth values. But of course, if you do that, then it violates truth and reference centrality. And in fact, if you look at Weimar's clause for predicate abstraction, it looks like a typographic variant of the Tarskian clause. The difference is that where Weimar has models reinterpreting names, the Tarskian has assignments reinterpreting variables. But we think at the end of the day, that comes to a distinction without a difference. So the Fregean approaches either end up violating compositionality, or they end up being fundamentally anti-Fregean, insofar as they demote truth and reference from their central role in the semantic theory. That's it. Thanks.